Chargers fans, we're going for it on fourth down and talking to you. This is Joe and Bob, team fans, talking about the Chargers to break down every team here. Staley is obviously not one of my boys. Gotta tell you, of the coaches I predict to get fired, -1 to get fired, he's in the top 3. And it's because he has an immense talent. He doesn't use it right. And in fact, a lot of his coaching decisions hold back a team that should win the Super Bowl from even being relevant. May I remind you, 28-3. All right, LA Chargers. So what do we got to look forward to this year? In the draft, or in the offseason, we get rid of our coordinators, the sacrificial lamb in Lombardi when it was really Staley as the issue, and bring in possibly the most overrated offensive coordinator in the NFL in Kellen Moore. And we look at this and go, well, what are they going to do? The team can't rush the quarterback to save their lives on defense. They can't really do anything on defense. They have 3.5 players on defense. They have one of the Bosas. They have Sebastian Day, who could develop into a pass rusher if he's not asked to be the number 2. And then obviously they got the safety in Derwin James. The rest of their defense is holes. And what do they do with their first pick in their draft, Bob? They get a 4th receiver that may never hit the field when everyone's healthy and doing things correct. I fully admit I'm a Josh Palmer believer, and I might be overinflating his value. Mm-hmm. Quentin Johnston, this is nothing against him as a talented player. I do think he actually is potentially going to have a great career, but that's not what you do when you have a team that's ready to win now. You go out and you get a pass rusher to try to hide holes on your defense, because that's what the Chargers needed to do, and they didn't. Long story short, and quite frankly, every pick they made after the 3rd round is going to be a bust. You go by various different metrics. I just have ESPN's in front of me here. Not a single one of them is rated above a 46 from the 4th round on. So we're looking at 3 players we added to this team, essentially. Another receiver in a position we can't use, a middle linebacker, and an outside linebacker in a 4-3 scheme when the outside linebacker doesn't do the pass rush. So aside from that, Bob, how do you feel about the LA Chargers?
There's one word that needs to be said about the Chargers, and that word is explosion, for 2 reasons. The reason I say explosion is the word that describes the Los Angeles Chargers here is that they did not accumulate enough explosive pass plays in the pass game this year. They also let up some of the most explosive rush plays on defense this year, and they also let up explosive pass plays on defense this year. This defense had some of the most injuries I've seen in a 2-3 week span of time, particularly on their defensive line. Now, I can't expect a team to perform adequately if you are now rushing out people every other week to play a position that they should know how to play, but maybe they're not as best as your number.
Well, as good as Bosa, just the way it is.
Right? And so Bosa missed 13 games last year. And so you're looking at a team that still made the playoffs. They were running on fumes, and then Staley decides to play all the starters in a Week 18 game against the Broncos, and Williams goes and fractures his back. Well, obviously, when you go down and
they were already guaranteed in the playoffs at that point.
Yeah, and you go down with one of your top weapons, who you're already having injuries all over the field at every position all year, and you go out there, lose arguably one of your biggest weapons, tallest weapons.
That certainly.
And then you come out and you take a lead in the playoff game, but then you can't sustain it. Now, one of the damaging things for the Chargers, and it's the thing that I hate to say, but the run game is severely inconsistent and inadequate in the Chargers organization. That is nothing to say negatively about Austin Eckler as a player, but what he provides to this team needs to come from something else as well. Austin Eckler has had games in the past, and even this past year, where you could look at his stat sheet and he would have 8 carries, 21 yards, and then 100 yards receiving and 2 touchdowns. You could look and he would have 8 yards, but then he'd have 112 yards receiving. As an organization, and I believe we talked about this in the season in review, the struggles in the decision to decide to keep Austin Eckler is the way this organization is going to go. Do I think this team could make the playoffs each year? Of course I can. Justin Herbert is a phenomenal player. And if we weren't talking about Patrick Mahomes every single second, we would probably be having a discussion about how good Justin Herbert is and what he needs to do better.
Mm-hmm.
One of the problems with this organization throughout the history of this organization has been the lack of depth. When a starter goes down, they have depth pieces to replace it, but the depth pieces are not at the same talent level as the players that they lost because they buy big and then they fill in the gaps everywhere else. Mm-hmm. Now, when you look at this organization on paper as an offense, you're saying to yourself, okay, this is a team, if health it wasn't an issue, that should be able to win at least 10 games.
Oh, yeah.
Offensively. Then you look at the defense on paper and you say, they stay healthy. We shouldn't lose games in the fourth quarter at the very least. But what we saw in that wild card game with a healthy organization was damning.
Yes.
28-3 is an Atlanta type of number. And we've been dogging Atlanta for years about losing the Super Bowl in that way to Tom Brady. And we're going to be dogging the Chargers franchise for years for losing to the Jacksonville Jaguars in the way that they did. Jacksonville outplayed them in the second half. And you saw Asante Samuel.
Actually outplayed them in the first half, too. They just had bad beats.
Right. But you say Asante Samuel Jr. getting those interceptions and run them. I mean, like, this is it. When I say explosions, this is a team that gives up too many and doesn't produce enough. And when you don't produce enough and you give up too many, you're going to lose games when you shouldn't lose games.
And Bob, you hit a very important part that gets lost on those who just want that, is that you have explosive ability with offense, but they have no ability to close out a game from a roster construction standpoint. If you have a lead and you're the Chiefs, you just give it to Pacheco and you run it out. You know, if you are behind, sure, you throw your way back into it. But or if you have a lead and you're the Steelers, you just sack the quarterback because the offense can't do anything against you. Okay, this offense on paper has one of the best passing games in the NFL, but it can't close a game out because, as we said about the Bengals a couple of weeks ago, they score too quickly sometimes, or Staley's retard goes for it on fourth down and they lose the ball. And then next thing you know, you're giving the ball up at the 38-yard line. And then,
with a minute and a half to go.
Exactly. And then we lose on a last-second field goal. Well, this is the thing. So it's a combination of mostly roster poor construction, but Staley does not get the most out of this team, and regularly he is holding it back.
Yeah, and to your point,
he's hidden by the shield of Herbert.
And to your point, I'm going back to what I stated is that they didn't produce enough explosive plays in the pass game. But you are exactly right, is that this roster, as it's constructed, is perfectly capable of producing explosive plays. Mm-hmm. And that's the one thing about this organization that is so confusing. And you look at it from a roster construction standpoint and you say, why isn't this team producing 12, 13, 14 wins every year? Why isn't there only 2 losses to the Chiefs every year? What is happening? And they're like the New York Giants of the West because for so many years, the Chargers organization has been ravaged by injuries. The Giants organization has been ravaged by injuries. Every single year, it feels like I'm seeing, even going back to Rivers' days, going back to Drew Brees' days, I'm seeing important players on offensive line and defensive line hurting themselves week after week after week. I'm seeing a guy in Keenan Allen that can't stay on the field more than 13 games out of the year. Now, granted, that's that could be on a specific player or a group of players, but I'm wondering what's going on with their health and wellness staff over there in Los Angeles, because that aspect of it, these players should not. You look at other teams and you look at the series of injuries that they accumulate, and you look at like how those injuries are affecting the team. You shouldn't have like 8 guys out.
Yeah, they're one of the 5 teams that gets plagued year in and year out, and it doesn't make sense.
Yeah, you shouldn't have 8 starters go down with season-ending injuries. Mm-hmm. Where's the conditioning at? What's happening?
Well, it's also how do we use these guys? You brought up the best example. It's an irrelevant game, week 18. Why are our starters on the field? Like what are we doing here? And to put this as my final thought is they don't believe this is a problem at all, because whole draft, a lot of wasted picks from the 4th round on that are just unquality reaches. None of them at running back. And is it like the running back that's said he was all in and he's never going to leave? No, he requested a trade.
And your backup is Isaiah
draft a running back?
Drafted last year, I believe.
Still, I mean, you don't give him the ball is the point. What I would have done is, yes, you do have the one from last year, but we don't know who he is. Get a second one in there, create competition, and then if camp hits and something's great, then you do move Eckler and get a piece for him.
Yeah, and you saw how the Chargers of a couple of years ago, I'm not saying Melvin Gordon is a better running back than, I'm not saying he's a better player than Austin Eckler.
He's not, but yeah.
But when they had him on the team, there was a difference in the way that they played.
Mm-hmm.
And, granted, they're pretty similar and the coaches were different, but like, I look at final thought on the Chargers here. I look at this team, and just like the Denver Broncos, this is a team that could easily compete with the Chiefs for the number 1 seed in the division.
Mm-hmm.
Easily. But for one reason or another, there's always a disappointment. And I would love to see Justin Herbert go to a Super Bowl. I would love to see this organization make it to an AFC championship game in the next couple of years. But the way it's run, you hate on Houston and you hate on Oakland. Mm-hmm. I have a problem with the way this organization in general has generational players sometimes.
Mm-hmm.
And they still can't do anything. Nothing. And that is so frustrating to be a Chargers fan. And there should be more Chargers fans. But you're looking at it, you're like, well, what have you done for me lately? You've done absolutely nothing. So why do I even have to pay attention? And in Los Angeles, where there is more things to pay attention to, one of them is not the Chargers. And that is the worst part about the Chargers as a franchise, is that move from San Diego to Los Angeles has now made them basically 4th on the totem pole in terms of who I'm interested in. And the Chargers, going on another Los Angeles team, the Chargers are a lot like the Angels. The Angels in baseball have the 2 best players, arguably, of our generation, mm-hmm. of our lifetime in baseball. And they can't make the playoffs. Now, baseball's a different sport than football. It's played differently. The teams and players matter a lot more in that. But I look at it and I say, why would I root for the Chargers?
I'm rooting for the Chargers to go to St. Louis.
And I'm even wearing their color today unintentionally.
Yes, and you are, Bob.
I want them to be successful, but I'm not. I'm only faced with disappointment. And I hate to say that out of a Justin Herbert-led team, but he's got to show us more. He's got to show us more leadership. He's got to show us he can take the game on his back and make these decisions. He's got to show us that he can get Austin Eckler to actually be a running back more than 40% of the game. And unfortunately, what I think the realistic expectations for the Chargers is second or third in the conference or in the division, second or third in the division, and you're maybe going to then squeak your way into another playoff spot. But realistically, I think they're going to be left out in the dust when all's said and done. And you look at what's going to happen in the AFC East, you look at what's going to happen in the AFC North, one person from the AFC South, and then what's going to happen in the AFC West with a potentially rising Denver team. So we'll see what happens here, but they might be the odd person out in this scenario.
It could be. And to answer your question, Bob, you can't hand the ball to someone you don't have.
Good point.